Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for today, January 21st, 2021. Well, yesterday was Inauguration Day, and we saw the absurd formulation coming from the mouth of Joe Biden, but actually given to him by his oligarchic controllers with his call for unity in the United States. Now, to me, this recalled a much more famous speech on this question of unity delivered in 1858, in June of 1858, by Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln at the time said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And what he said is the division of the Union into half slave, half free cannot endure permanently. Again, this was in 1858, 2 years before his election as president, and nearly 3 years before the division of the country with the Civil War. Now, the deeper issue which Lincoln understood in addressing this was the difference between the American system of physical economy and the British free trade system, against which the American Revolution was fought, and which the Founding Fathers understood was the dividing line. A nation which could act in its own sovereign interest for the benefit of its people, as opposed to being a vassal to private special interests controlled from outside. Slavery was a policy of the British system, a cheap labor policy, basically a free labor policy. But it was a policy of defining an agrarian society of a planter aristocracy, which produced cotton for the British textile mills, but it was allied with New York banks and Boston traders, the clipper ship families. And this continues to be the dividing line today. This is the issue in the United States today. What is Biden demonstrating from his first day in office? That he's going to overturn those policies of Trump, which defended the idea of the American economy as a tool for the sovereignty of the American people. Biden is going with the Great Reset, which is a policy of a Green New Deal. No industry, no energy production, global free trade for the benefit of a global corporate aristocracy. And this is what Biden is acting to do. Now contrast that with the 4 years ago, the emergence of President Trump in the campaign of 2016, where at the end he was emphasizing restoring Glass-Steagall banking separation, which took away the power of the banks to be bailed out and to endlessly speculate. He called for infrastructure investment. He called for fair trade. And he called for investment in science and technology. That was a call for a national mission based on the ideas of the American system. And in the first months of his presidency, he gave several addresses where he spoke explicitly about what he called accurately the American system. Connected to this was his call to end wars. So a policy of ending the permanent warfare of the war hawk faction in both parties, and instead investing in the real physical economy. And he tried to bring Republicans in to support this in the tradition of Lincoln. Instead, we saw the so-called rhinos, who are really totally allied with the Democrats, people like McConnell, Paul Ryan, the whole crowd of Republicans who, now that Trump appears to be gone, they're going to go ahead to join the Democrats in calls for austerity against the economy, the physical economy, in favor of speculation. Now, the issue for that faction of the Republicans, as well as for the Democrats and for the elite of the United States, the so-called elite, really the corporate cartels that were allied with the British, directly with British intelligence. And by the way, we saw some of this with the release of the document yesterday of the FBI interview with Christopher Steele, the ex-MI6 operative who wrote the dossier which was used in the FISA court to get the warrant to spy on the Trump campaign and Donald Trump himself. The FBI interview included Steele explicitly saying that he was opposed to Trump because of his fear that Trump would interfere with the special relationship between Britain and the United States, and that this would harm the interests of the British, and that therefore he decided to expose the so-called connection to Putin, which, as it turned out, was a bunch of lies that Steele injected into the debate, which became the basis of Russiagate. So the issue of what was used to subvert Trump was Russiagate, and this became the basis of the coup. Now keep in mind, going back to Lincoln, Lincoln was an ally of Tsar Alexander of Russia, as of course George Washington had been the beneficiary in the Founding Fathers of the support of Catherine the Great of Russia, who was part of the League of Armed Neutrality. So in the American Revolution and in the Civil War, both of which were in a large extent against the British Empire, Russia was an ally. And to break out of the globalism of the Bush regime and the Obama regime, President Trump made an effort to establish a friendly, cooperative relationship with President Putin of Russia, targeting terrorism, targeting drug trafficking, money laundering, and other kinds of crimes. And for that, he was put on trial. For that, a special counsel was called in. So when you look at this, you look back 150 years ago, 140 years ago, to the Lincoln-Russian alliance then. And what you find out is that the British hated that. They did not want the United States working with Russia. Same thing today, because that undermines British strategic and imperial interests. So what is Biden's policy today, the so-called unity policy? Well, it's the global banker's dictatorship. You're going to unify the American people under a dictatorship of corporate cartels in banking, finance, big pharma, raw materials, and so on. It's a cartel that will enforce the Green New Deal, which will shut down physical production. Well, what kind of unity will it be? A unity of paupers in America begging for crumbs from the government because the real source of wealth, the physical economy, is being systematically dismantled. And to enforce it is a divide and conquer strategy, or today more appropriately called gang, counter-gang. You have the racial division, which was played back at the time of the Civil War, which is still being used to undercut the idea of a national mission, black against white. You have urban versus rural, Democrats versus Republicans, liberals versus conservatives. And all of it is enforced by developing the idea of an enemy image, that the enemy's coming to get us. For many, many years it was Russia, and in Russiagate it was still Russia. To Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton, it's still Russia. But to many Republicans now, and also Democrats, it's China. So rally unity by having an enemy image. When President Trump came into office, he was trying to work and establish friendly cooperative relations with both Russia and China, which was sabotaged by the war hawks and neoliberals who opposed him in both parties. Now, the global dictatorship would be enforced by U.S. military, which is what was done under Bush and Obama, and in the U.S. by censorship. Censorship from Silicon Valley, which is now an integral part of the military-industrial complex. And they're going to move toward a new Patriot Act, which would be, in a sense, a domestic war on terror. CNN yesterday had a segment just showing the extent to which they're going to try to demonize the opposition to Biden's policies. It was an interview with an author of a book called The Cult of Trump. And essentially what it said, the author said, is the whole group of Trump supporters, that is 75 million people, need to go through deprogramming. Now, that's not a sign of unity. You want unity? We need to go back to a national mission based on America's economic sovereignty in collaboration with other sovereign nations against the power of the British Empire. We need cooperation and partnership with Russia and China, which was available at the beginning of the Trump administration, but was sabotaged by people such as Bolton, by the Pelosi-Schumer Russiagate story and by Mike Pompeo. If you want to crush the City of London, bring the most powerful sovereign nations on the planet together. But if the Biden administration has its way, the U.S. will no longer be a sovereign nation, but will be subservient to the rules of the global corporate cartels. And secondly, a national mission to revive the physical economy of the United States, which requires LaRouche's 4 laws. So instead of the phony unity spouted by Joe Biden, who was put in office by the most divisive network that exists internationally, instead, we need a national mission around LaRouche's policies, which define a positive agenda for a future for the United States and for the world. So thank you for listening today. Please look at the possibility of contributing to the LaRouche organization because we need funds to carry out this fight. And remember, tomorrow, as Friday, I'll be taking your questions. Send your questions to me directly at harleysch@gmail.com. So see you tomorrow.